We're going to discuss slavery in the colonies, but first we need to clear up some common misconceptions. You see, most people think slavery wasn't around until the Underground Railroad that is so famous and Harriet Tubman saving all the slaves. Well, some people also think that slavery was around until the Civil War. Some people think that slavery wasn't even a big deal until the Civil War, because that's what we were fighting the Civil War about, was slavery, right? Well, we need to know what the truth is. The truth is that slavery has been around since Bible times. Stories you're probably familiar with talk about the Israelites being enslaved by the Egyptians and many other countries and people enslaving others, and this goes on and on throughout time. But for us, slavery was brought to Jamestown because the amount of tobacco being grown could only be harvested with the help of slaves. We couldn't do it without slaves. And there were even some cases of free blacks owning farmland and then owning slaves to work that land. Which sounds kind of backwards from what we typically know. And then there were some indentured servants or slaves that could earn their freedom, and that's how this sentence makes sense. As they were indentured servants, they earned their freedom, and then they owned land. So let's talk about the difference between these enslaved Africans and these free Africans. We'll look at political, economic, and social reasons for each. And in your notes, you can just start here and right here, and then underneath here, write this column here. Politically, enslaved African Americans had no political voice. They had no rights at all until the 3/5 Compromise, which was later on in the Constitution, and that's how they got representation. And so really, politically, if you were an enslaved African American, you had no rights. You couldn't do anything at all. You couldn't even win your freedom. As far as free African Americans, they still had no political voice. And they had limited and restricted rights, even as free men. Some economic factors of enslaved and free African Americans. As far as an enslaved African American, they were the labor source of the plantation system. They were considered property. And children were considered property, and a lot of times they were sold with no regard to keeping them with their parents. It didn't matter if children or parents wanted their children to stay with them. It didn't matter. Children were still property. It didn't matter who your mom and dad were. You could be sold as property to other slave owners. As far as free African Americans, they were the low wage earners. This was the people who really would do the worst jobs for the least amount of pay. But they were free, and so they're considered free, but they're the low wage earners that really could never earn enough money to buy anything nice. Okay? As far as social and social factors for the enslaved and free African Americans, enslaved African Americans were viewed outside of the American identity. That means they weren't even viewed as real Americans here. If you were free, you were the lowest social class, but you were an American. If you were a slave, you're not even American to those slave owners. And in their communities, they had loose communities within the plantation system, and these enslaved African Americans really had to depend on themselves in those communities for anything and everything. And there were three most special ideas for those slaves. The first one is family, and how important family is to your community. The next one is religion. And the next one is active resistance. That's resisting your slave holder and the government, really, because they're making you be slaves anyway. Similarly, the free African Americans and their social factors, they were the lowest social class, of course. Not as low as the slaves, but the slaves weren't even considered in the social class system. So the free African Americans were the lowest social class. They had limited access to education. There were very few free African Americans who knew how to read, and there were even fewer slave African Americans, because the slave owners wanted to keep them ignorant. They wanted to keep them stupid and dumb, because if you had smart slaves, they would figure out a way to outsmart you and overthrow you. So we wanted to keep them dumb. And so even as free African Americans, they had very limited access to education or books or reading or anything like that. They were also socially isolated. They're the people that aren't allowed to use the same public things that the typical white Southerners are. And the three most special ideas for the free African Americans are very similar to the enslaved African Americans: family, religion, and resistance. So the impact of slavery in the South is huge, because enslaved people, even though they were viewed as property, they were still the only labor supply. They're the ones that are going to work and harvest and do all the hard work that a lot of people didn't want to do. They aided in the development of the plantation system and the agrarian Southern economy. Agrarian means farming. So you'll see that word probably a lot, but agrarian sounds like agriculture, and that's where we get that word from. Agrarian Southern economy.